Hello, everyone, and welcome to our December First Friday webinar. Today we got Melinda Gilliam from University of Washington, Seattle, and she'll be talking about mixed, not mixed up. Don't forget that at the end I will have an assessment, and I'll put that in the comment section and in the chat box, and you can go ahead and fill that out. But I'm going to go ahead and send it over to Melinda.
Hello, everyone. Welcome. Thank you so much for tuning in. Today I will be presenting Mixed, Not Mixed Up. So I'm very excited to be able to share this with you today. I'm going to go ahead and switch my screen over so you're able to see my presentation. Throughout the presentation, if you were to have questions, please feel free to add them in the comment box, and I will address them once we get to the end of the presentation, so I'm not flipping back and forth. But I do welcome your questions as you have them. So I'll go ahead and share my screen now. Okay. So welcome again. As I mentioned, this is Mixed, Not Mixed Up, and we're going to talk today about multiracial identity and the development in college students of that identity. So I'll start off by telling you a little bit about my why. So Mixed, Not Mixed Up was a presentation that I initially developed while I was in undergrad at Central Washington University. I was an RA there, and John Mounsey actually shoulder tapped me and was like, hey, you should consider doing this at a continual all staff meeting if you have a topic you're interested in presenting. I was like, wow, what would I present? And at that time, I was knee deep in Black Student Union and kind of figuring out my identity. And so I presented Mixed, Not Mixed Up. Of course, what it looked like then and what it looks like now are two very different things. More so when it started, it was about myself as a mixed individual, whereas now it shares more about people who identify as being multiracial. So that's where it started. And the title itself, Mixed, Not Mixed Up, is really claiming that multiracial individuals are not confused. Oftentimes, we are told that, oh, that can't be your identity, or that doesn't make sense, when really we're concrete, or at least we have chosen the way that we identify, and we believe that. So that's a little bit about the title. I just wrapped up my master's program in May at Kansas State University, and for the first time in my life, sitting in a student development class and going over theory, I felt confident in the way that I identified, and that was through a theory that we'll dive into a little bit later. But after having that moment of realization and that feeling of comfort and confidence, I was thinking about, how can I give this to other people in the line of work that I do? And so I went back to the presentation Mixed, Not Mixed Up, and began refining and learning and growing and researching to give you the presentation that we have today. And the last thing that pushed me to actually present this presentation, first at NWACUHO and then at ACUHO last summer, and now with this webinar, was a message that I got from a friend that I knew when I was younger. And she said much in the message, but this is the line that really stuck out. As a mixed kid, you also made me feel less alone. And I was thinking back to when I knew her when I was about 7 years old, and I was thinking, what was I doing at the age of 7 that was so remarkable? Probably nothing, but just being myself. And so I started rethinking, what ways can I be myself, and can I show up for those other multiracial individuals, especially the students that I work with. So again, a little background as to why this presentation. So as we go through, I'm asking that we keep in mind some essential pieces. The first of which is, while I'm very passionate, I am no expert in this. It is very salient to me as I identify myself as a multiracial individual. I actually identify situationally, which we'll dive into a little bit later, but most often as a multiracial individual. And I will be speaking from my lens, and my lens is a Black and white multiracial individual. But I want to acknowledge that multiracial is a myriad of identity and is more than just Black and white. Whereas in media, we often see the glorification of multiracial individuals who identify as Black and white, and the people who identify as different mixing of identities within multiracial other than Black and white are often dismissed. And so while my lens is Black and white, I acknowledge that multiracial is more than that. And I like to say it's an identity. I tell you how I identify, and I ask that you respect that, and I will do the same for you throughout this presentation and as you're asking questions and whatnot. Okay, so normally at conferences, what I ask is why this session, who is in the room, who's in the session, and what do you know? And so as we go through, I kind of want you to pause and take a moment to reflect on why did you tune in today? What are you hoping to get from this? What are you bringing in your identities into the space here, virtual space, if you will? And what do you know? Are you an expert? Are you just beginning? Think about where you're at in the process of learning. Okay, so this is an overview of what we'll be going over in the presentation today. The first piece, we'll dive into multiracial identity and who the we of that, who we are. Then we'll go into a bit of theory. We'll take a break with some media, some YouTube videos, and some narrative sharing there. Then we'll go into some hashtags from students that I have interacted with. We'll talk about the challenges, and then we'll talk about how to support multiracial individuals. So I'd like to start off by asking, what is multiracial? If you think to yourself, if you were to take a moment, I'll give you a moment here to think about what multiracial is. It's more challenging to define than you would initially think. So I'll just give you about 10 seconds here to think about what multiracial is. Okay, so when I was putting together this presentation initially, I was like, you know what, we Google everything nowadays. I'm gonna go ahead and Google it. So I asked Google to define multiracial, and what Google had shared was made up relating to people of several or many races. And at first I found myself almost offended by how simple that was. I was like, man, I'm more complex than that. What are you doing, Google? But really, when you think about it, it has to be that vague to encompass the diversity within the multiracial community. So thank you, Google, for, for being broad enough to realize our complexities. What else I found interesting about this screenshot is Google does a thing where they tell you the use of the word over time. So as you can see, as it gets closer to the 1950s, 1960s, it starts to pick up, and in the thousands, it's much higher than it ever had been. And so I was thinking about, what happened around that time? What happened 51 years ago to increase the use of this word? And I know many people might be wondering that as well. And what I encountered, specifically what happened 51 years ago as of this year, was the Loving case. The Loving case was a Supreme Court case that legalized interracial marriage for the first time. Now, to me, it's just mind-blowing to think that that was only 51 years ago. My mom this year will be, actually as of yesterday, is 59. So this was in her lifetime that happened. And what does this mean for us as higher education professionals? Well, this means that we may have some of the first generations of legal, if you will, multiracial people on our campuses. And it's really a call to action that we need to step forward and figure out how we support these individuals in multiracial identity development as they navigate campuses for the first time and are really finding out what it means to them. So I mentioned we chat through a bit of theory. This is Wren's patterns of multiracial identity. And what Wren really hits on here is that identity patterns amongst mixed race college students are fluid, variable, and non-exclusive. And when I read this in my theory class, I had to reread it. I was like, wow, you're right. That's what I've been feeling my whole life, but nobody has ever given me, I've never felt the support or the ability to say that. I've always been told, what are you? You need to pick something. And so this was very freeing to me to realize that I didn't have to pick and stick to. Now, Wren has different categories in which multiracial individuals will identify within. The first of which is monoracial, choosing to identify with one or of multiple races. So for example, I'm Black and white, but if I choose to identify as being Black, then that would be an example of identifying as being monoracial. Then there's multiple monoracial, choosing to identify with multiple individual races. So if somebody asks me, how I identify, and I say I identify as Black and white, those are two separate races that are individual but sit next to each other, if you will. Then there's multiracial. This is where you find the terms mixed, biracial, those type of terms, and choosing to identify with a term that suggests the mixing of multiple races. So again, the working together, the unique mixing again of the races. There's extraracial, where you're choosing not to identify or adhere to a particular categorization of race, so staying away from perhaps engaging in one way or identifying at all. And then the last one here is situational, and that's choosing to identify race situationally. And I mentioned when I introduced myself that most often I identify as being multiracial, but I actually identify situationally. So for example, in the environment of being around my family, I'm the only person of color in my family. The rest of my family is white. In that space, I identify as being Black, which is monoracial. Excuse me. In the context of my friends group that I hang out with most often, those individuals identify as being Black, and in that group I identify as being Black and multiracial. And so it just depends on the context and the environment in which the way I identify will vary. And I think that, as I mentioned, this took me until my graduate experience. I was 23, 24 when somebody said to me, or I read in a book, that I didn't have to choose. And it allowed me to really dive deeper into my identity and explore the areas that I hadn't explored previously because I was told I couldn't go there because I had chosen, right? So I think it's important to remember this theory and to share this with our students and to understand this when working with our students. Okay, we're going to take a little bit of a media break. When we tested the videos earlier, the videos themselves might be slow, but you should still be able to hear. If not, I'll kind of pay attention and I'll summarize at the end of the video. Each video is about 2 minutes, so I'll just summarize toward the end.
My whole life, up until I was 8 years old, I thought that I was white. Looking back, I'm like, how did I think that? Because all my brothers and sisters, they all had blonde hair and blue eyes. I obviously don't. I don't consider myself to be half anything unless someone asks what I'm really composed of. Because I don't see myself as relating sometimes to this and sometimes to that. I'm just me.
On college campuses across the United States, there are more mixed-race students than any time before, and they are making their voices heard.
I was in Illinois for a really long time this summer, and there's just a lot of white people in Illinois. It's scary. Like,
they are at the forefront of a demographic shift in the United States, driven by Asian and Latino immigration and an increased number of ethnic and racial intermarriages. These young people are leading a sea change in how we think about race, ethnicity, and its place in society, and their numbers are only expected to increase. I'm Susan Solney with the New York Times, and I've spent several months getting to know mixed-race students at the University of Maryland.
Oh, are you mixed? Yeah. Who do you mix with?
Laura Wood is a 19-year-old college student. She is vice president of the school's Multiracial and Biracial Student Association.
We talk about issues that relate to like the multiracial, multicultural community.
The group is dedicated to promoting multicultural awareness on campus.
You guys should come out. Diversity. We're gonna have. My responsibility has been to plan and conduct meetings. I realized that I can make a difference. Like, I can help people who don't know about their identities and who aren't talking because they're scared and they don't want to be judged. I can help them.
The group holds sessions every Wednesday night to talk about multiracial issues.
I'm pretty Black. Like, it would appear to you that I'm like 100% whatever, like, African country I'm from. But even then, my grandmother is half German. Like, the last 3 rings, her eyes are blue. You never should guess that from, like, my pigment. But
automatically, when you're multiracial, you're different. And we understand that there's a lot of different perspectives and points of view that have to be shared. So when you have so many people in one group that are talking about the same topic, tons of different sides of it, you really open your mind and it creates a safe space, or else the conversation couldn't happen. I know that what I've been through, they've been through similar things. And I mean, like, people want to acknowledge me a lot of times as Black, but it's my white mother that raised me. Like, I don't even know my biological father.
When Laura was 8 years old, her mother and aunt explained to her that the man she'd been calling Dad wasn't really her father. That's when she first learned that she was mixed race and part Black.
And I started crying, of course. You know, I was 8 years old. I just figured out that who I thought I was really wasn't who I was. And then she's like, and your real father's Black. And I was just so taken aback. It's like, what do you mean? I thought that my skin was darker because I swam a lot. I was always in the pool, so I was like, well, that's why I'm darker. And I figured my hair was curly when just because people have curly hair. It's like, so I'm really, really not who I thought I was.
I identify myself as an African American.
18-year-old freshman Aaron Bozeman also comes from a white mother and an African-American father.
You look at President Obama, who's definitely heralded as the first African-American president. People still identify you based on what you look like. Okay, so I'm clearly not a white person to most people. So to identify myself as such, regardless of my behavior, is that is my race, is Black, because that is what I look like. If I act white, maybe that's my ethnic group, perhaps, but it's certainly not my race. I
identify myself as Black and white. If somebody tries to call me Black, I'm like, yep, and white. It's like I never try to deny one side of myself because it's important who I am.
Okay, so in that video, you heard from college students who are experiencing the development of their identity and the sharing of it in various situations. But a couple things I wanted to point out from that video: the existence of a multiracial student organization. I know that on some campuses, that's not a resource that is available to students, but if you have the ability to encourage it, or if students are wanting to try to put one together, what can you do to support that? Because as we've heard from the students in the video, and I've experienced myself, and I think others could speak to, but that space is beneficial to process that identity and the different instances where you encounter your identity being called out, if you will. I also wanted to highlight in that video that the gentleman was talking about being perceived as Black because of the way that he looks, and it still doesn't matter. He was saying how you identify because it's the way that you look. And I think that's, as walking around in society, I encounter that quite often. But for multiracial individuals, often part of their identity is completely dismissed. Well, you have dark skin, so you cannot identify as being white, or that white aspect doesn't matter, or that other aspect that is light doesn't matter because you have melanin and darker pigment. So I think that's important to recognize there as well. Okay, so I'm going to show you another video. This video is different. It's more frank in talking about the experiences of multiracial individuals, and it's called, it's this last one down here, Shutting Down BS About Multiracial Identity.
What are you?
A muggle, unfortunately.
Hi, I'm Dylan Maron, and I am here to shut down some bullshit about multiracial identity with a group of multiracial people. Hi.
Hi.
How are you? Now, this is a topic that is very near and dear to my heart, and an episode that I wanted to do for a while. So I'm so glad you're here. Are you ready to shut down some bullshit?
Yes.
Okay, great. Well, pick one.
Oh, God.
I got it at the DMV, and the person behind the counter, I looked up at them when I realized I could only choose one, and she was just like, what's the problem?
I got it applying for college, and we had a college counselor, and I vividly remember her saying that I just have a better chance of getting into schools if I identified as fully Black, and I opted against it, and I picked other. But that was the first time I was like, are you kidding me?
I feel comfortable saying I'm a Black man, because that's
that's who I am, and Black is a multitude of things.
Yeah, I feel that. Like I also feel very comfortable calling myself Black and saying that I'm Black, and that doesn't exclude or disclude any of the other truths about my life, and nobody else gets to make that decision for me.
The other box.
I've always checked other. That's what my college essay was about. Always choosing other.
Mine was too.
Yeah.
It was all our college essays.
Yeah, that's always sort of how I have identified is sort of as other. What's troublesome about it is that she chose other, I chose other. We don't have the same background. So like, how in the world can you lump us together? What is it saying on these government documents that we're other? What are you getting at by lumping us together?
As a person of color, as a Black person, like I am othered in general, but even within a Black community, I am othered as well. So there's this sort of like triple consciousness that happens where it's like, I know who I am and I know how to exist, but I know how people will perceive me. But then like on top of that perception, there's another perception that I have to deal with. And it's also, I think, othering as well. Like when there's a certain look that people give me that I'm sure that we all have experienced where it's like, yeah, like trying to figure it out. And it's like, that's a form of othering. Like it's just like, oh, it's like again and again and again.
You must be so confused when it comes to activism. Whose side are you on?
We should be picking the side of right, regardless of what race we are.
I'm always on the side of people who are being oppressed. And my upbringing, both because I'm multiracial and just because of who raised me, made that very, very clear.
If anything, the fact that I am so fair-skinned only makes me feel more responsible in my activism to be visible and vocal and on the side of right, on the side of people who are oppressed, because although I am multiracial, because I pass as white inadvertently, I have more privileges than anyone else in my family. And that's something that I feel I owe a responsibility on myself, on behalf of my family, to be out there doing everything I can and speaking out as much as possible.
You're not.
Okay. So that video, again, there's a couple things I wanted to highlight within. The notion of picking one. This is something that I encountered as a college student quite often, and I think our college students on our campuses continue to encounter to this day. But from the moment they're applying to the university, they're checking boxes, and then throughout their experience, they're being forced to choose and to pick and find where they fall. For example, there was a Black student union at Central Washington University, but there was not a mixed student union. And so it was a choice to explore my identity in that group. But as the gentleman in the video said, in the Black community, I'm often othered as a mixed individual. So just considering the different areas where we're forcing our students to choose, or it might not be forcing, but encouraging our students to choose, wanting them to choose, and asking ourselves, why is it important that we know? And is it beneficial for us to maybe take that off or reconsider the need to know there? They were chatting about their college essays and talking about always checking the other box and the frustration that comes along with that. Multiracial individuals are often othered, while aspects of the mixed identity will be accepted. For example, if I check the box as being Black, people are like, okay, yeah, sure, you're Black. But the next minute when I check other or try to explain my identity, they get lost and don't follow. And so I think, again, if everyone's writing their college essay about the frustration with that, it's a call to action for us to figure out what we can do to at least revisit our practices and our policies and see what we can do to adjust to be in support of that. In the climate of our nation now, there's quite a bit of activism that is going on, and the confusion with the activism just because we're mixed race. I think that was kind of funny when I watched the video the first time. Just because you're a mixing of of races doesn't mean you're straddling which side you're on, or can't have a clear opinion of activism. And so as our students are navigating campuses with a lot of information and navigating what it means to be independent and choosing where they fall on issues, it can be challenging. So what are we doing to support them in that exploration of how their identity impacts the way that they are opting into or standing back from activism? And then the woman who spoke at the end, she spoke about being white passing, and I'm going to get into that a little bit later, but I want to acknowledge that that's an important piece to the story here. Okay, as I mentioned, I had the chance while at Kansas State to kind of chat with some of my friends as well as some of my students, student staff, and other mixed individuals around campus. And I said, what do you hear most often? Like, if I gave you the hashtag mixed life, what would you put in front of it? And these are some of the responses I got, as well as some that I found off of an internet site, which is listed at the bottom of the slide, but that kind of speak to mixed experience. So the first one, she's so pretty, where did you get her? This came up for a student while moving into the residence hall. Their first day on campus, one of the volunteers that was helping carry items into the hall and into her room had made a comment to her mom and her little sister saying, oh, she's so pretty, where did you get her? When they were fully related, they were sisters, they were mothers, mother and daughter. So there was some frustration there, obviously. You don't count, you're not really fill in the blank. I think this is especially relevant for multiracial individuals who, well, I guess a myriad of them, but the instance that I'm thinking of is, for example, if I'm the skin tone that I am, which is fairly light, and someone says, oh, ask me a question about an issue regarding Black Lives Matter, and then they dismiss me by saying, oh, you don't really count because you're not full Black, right? It's the discredit. You're almost discredited because you're not viewed as being whole, as being complete. Very interesting challenge there. Having people assume that they know how you identify because your sibling identifies that way. So I'm an only child. This is not something that I've experienced, but the student who shared this with me shared that her older sibling was about two years ahead. And so when he got to college, he was playing football and everyone knew him, and he was big and known in the Black Student Union and whatnot. But as she came into the university and started experiencing her time there, people just wanted to rope her immediately into Black Student Union and thought she identified as being Black when she identified as being multiracial. And so the reputation really preceded her in that sense. Having people guess your race and the first conversation will most likely be about your race, I think, tie in together. Many multiracial individuals walk around a campus or walk around the community surrounding their campus and their college experience and are stopped and asked, you look so exotic is a word that people hear quite a bit. What are you? First of all, I'm a person, but also exotic is for plants and animals. So maybe choosing a better word or encouraging people to ask themselves, why are you asking me that? Like, what purpose is it serving? And are you taking my time to satisfy a curiosity of yours? What is the point? Why are you asking? Being mindful of the experience of the individuals who are being asked. Being looked over because your appearance does not match your last name. There were a handful of examples with this, but I can even use my last name. My maiden name was Gallagher, which my mom and my mom's family is very, very white. Their skin is very white, and they're Irish. So when I would show up to the first day of school, people would say Melinda Gallagher, and never once did anyone guess it would be me. So it's just interesting to, students sitting in classes for the first day of school. We do that how often in colleges, and just continuing to have to justify that, like, I know it doesn't look like me, but it is me. That has a burden and an emotional impact for some. And then feeling like the accent piece in photos, students shared that when they go home for breaks and they're finally able to breathe a sigh of like, okay, people understand who I am, this is my family, I grew up with them, but still not quite feeling at home, if you will, like they belong, because they are the only or the darkest one in their family, or one side of their family when they take Christmas pictures with them, they're the lightest one. And so what does that mean in terms of how they're seen as being a part of the family or not? Okay, so now we'll chat through some challenges. When talking to students and trying to understand their challenges that they were experiencing, I kind of found that there were 3 broad categories in which most of their challenges fell within. The first of which was being forced to choose. The second was not being allowed to choose, so kind of the inverse of that. And then the last was the intersection of life. So being forced to choose, we chatted about this a little bit earlier in the webinar, but being asked from the get-go to check a box, right? Apply to the university, but check this box to tell us who you are, what you identify as, so we can begin to categorize you, right, in our system. The second was affinity groups, which we also chatted about. Do they exist for you? Do they not? There's this book that is fairly old now. It's on my shelf, and it is called The Interracial Experience. And I was reading a fascinating piece about how affinity groups can be a double-edged sword, if you will, where on one end, they can really allow individuals to process that identity, especially if you're coming from a household where you were not able to explore that aspect or that piece or that section of your identity, if you will. But on the other side, for some individuals, they go into a space and identify, for example, if you're light-skinned and you identify as being Black in Black Student Union, but then you are seen as you're being othered and like you don't quite belong. And so that discourages them from exploring that aspect of their identity. Assimilation. So while I was at Kansas State University, I worked in Ford Hall. And Ford Hall had about 600 women. Of the whole building, 80% were sorority women, and about 10% were identified as being women of color. And I was chatting with some of them after Rush Week, and they were telling me how exhausting it was to straighten their hair because they thought they would have a better chance of getting in, or try and buy clothes that made them look more like the people who were being selected, and the different ways that they were assimilating to try and increase their odds of being accepted in the different organizations. Another example of assimilation that came up was football players who join institutions, and then one was telling me that he made the choice to cut his dreads because he felt like he was getting a lot of attention and couldn't just fit in as a player, and they kept identifying him as the one with the dreads rather than taking the time to get to know his name and get to know what he brought to the table or the field, if you will. And then also being forced to choose is identity burnout. So after you get to campus and you were asked, you know, what are you? Who are you? And then you're on campus and you're trying to figure out where you fit in. What are you? Who are you? You're exhausted because day in, day out, you encounter situations in which you have to almost justify your existence as a multiracial individual. So there's a level of burnout there with being forced to choose. So the next one is being allowed to choose. So now that people are saying choose, 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 you finally choose and you say, all right, I identify as being Black. And then people are like, well, you look really light, so I think you're actually mixed. And you're like, oh my goodness, you just forced me to choose, but now you're not allowing me to tell you how I choose. You're assigning me an identity, right? That is, again, feeds back into that identity burnout and frustration and ongoing just burden, if you will. Running into ignorance, students were telling me that when they identified as being mixed, some of their professors did not understand, if you will, how they weren't just Black because their skin was dark, or they weren't just, you know, fill in the blank because they looked this way or acted this way. And then they'd have to again justify their existence, and their mom was this, their dad was this, their heritage, their culture, their, you know, so on and so forth was this. Okay, and then I told you we'd revisit the idea and the notion of passing. We'll also talk about light skin and dark skin. So passing, while I think always being a thing, has really risen to the surface in media and in society. What does it mean to be a passing individual? I had a couple colleagues when I was a grad student at K-State share with me their frustration. They identified as being mixed, one of whom was Puerto Rican and white. And she was constantly frustrated because in going home and going back to Puerto Rico and seeing that, like, hey, these are my people, and feeling that that was her home, she was othered by some of them, saying like, oh no, you're white. But then when she would be at K-State and be on campus, she would be frustrated because people did not see that she was Puerto Rican and would just assume she was white. And so there was frustration along with passing. There's also some privilege that comes along with passing. And so definitely something to be explored. I know University of Washington this year has established some different groups to process identity, one of which is a group of professionals of color, and it's an opt-in choice. And I've opted into that group and have had some wonderful discussions. Another is the multiracial as well as the white passing group to process identity. And we just had our first meeting, I believe it was last week, if not the week before. And some great conversations, some fruitful conversations, camaraderie built around shared frustration and experience there. So what are we doing to kind of process and figure out what it means, even as professionals, right? Because we can't really show up for our students and expect that they know and we can support them without figuring out, first of all, what does it mean? How do I fit into this? And how can I increase my understanding to be a better support? And the last area here is the intersection of life. So students were sharing with me the lack of time and space to explore their identity. Being a student takes a lot out of students, especially as they're transitioning into their first year on a campus or transitioning into a major or life events happen. So they have a hard time prioritizing the exploration of their identity, intentional exploration. The next one is an insufficient representation of qualified supports. Now, this isn't me saying that we need to hire people who look like our students, although there are studies that prove representation is important, and I would encourage us all to read those. But this is me saying that sometimes our supports exist in our departments, but they might not be the faces that are interfacing and interacting with students every day. So there might be somebody who works in payroll that is completely versed in different aspects of identity, or at least has experience in lived experience in that identity, but they are behind a desk where no one ever interacts with them. So that support is not a support. So what are you doing to get to know who's on your team and what supports exist around your campus and in places that you wouldn't typically just jump to as a first go-to? Competing identities. So for example, I am a sorority woman who also is an athlete, and I don't have time right now to dive into my racial identity because these identities are more salient to me at this moment. Responsibilities. We have some students who go home and are caretakers for their children or their parents or their family or their friends. And so their responsibilities occupy the time that they would have to explore their identity. And also the cultural capital. A lot of our students don't have the cultural capital to advocate for space or time or support to explore their identity. Okay, finally we get to support what we can do as professionals in higher education to support our students, our multiracial students. First of all, there are 3 sections here. First, educate yourself. We'll chat about that more in a second. Support all elements of space, both physical and psychological, and encourage exploration. So under educate yourself, use theory. I mentioned one, but there are many theories out there that can support the growth and development of multiracial individuals. Webinars, congratulations, you're here, you're doing it. We might not always have the money or the financial means to attend a conference or bring in a speaker, but webinars are a great way to really tune in and gain that knowledge without often having to shell out a bunch of money. Campus events, it's really easy as a professional, I'll say this, to go home at 5 because you've had a long day and you've been supporting students all day and you've been working hard. But if you can pick one day a month maybe to attend a campus event and first of all show up for your students and maybe go with them, but also to broaden your knowledge about what's going on in your campus community and learn who other resources, who other professionals are in different areas of campus, that could potentially help you in referring students to individuals who could be helpful or learning additional knowledge that would help you be more effective. Asking informed questions. I think our students oftentimes are willing to share their experiences, but we have to be good stewards of that, right? We can't just expect them to teach us everything. So what are you doing to educate yourself first and inform yourself on questions that would be appropriate to ask? And then check yourself and your practices. Revisit why you're asking for them to identify their race. Revisit what you're doing when you're splitting people up or when you're looking for ways to reach out to students. Why are you doing that? What is the point? Just checking that, not necessarily changing it. If it works for you in your institution, that's important, but at least intentionally revisiting that. Okay, so for support of all elements of space, I think it's important to acknowledge and validate. Now, that's what we've heard probably since day one or early on in most of our careers, but the importance and the weight that acknowledgement and validation carry is significant. So even going back to basics and acknowledging and validating can be important. Avoiding dichotomous thinking. Oftentimes our students, right, come from wherever home was, and they have inherited values of those around them, and oftentimes haven't had a chance to explore the gray. So helping students to see that there might be another option when thinking about identity is important. And then working with the context of the college environment. So oftentimes we have affinity groups, and those are obvious supports, right? Affinity groups or identity groups. But I think sometimes we need to think about what we don't have on our campuses, and then how we can be good partners to the campuses around us and in our region, right? Like if there is a chance for a social media group between different campuses, or if one campus has a Black student union, but your campus doesn't, what can you do to connect some of your students to the experiences or the programming efforts that they're putting on? Is that appropriate? And utilizing technology. We live in an era where most people have access to technology, not all, but most. And so if the supports do not exist on your campus, how can you connect our students via technology to get the support they need? And then under encourage exploration, create brave spaces to process identity. I think with this just really comes intentionality, right? What are you doing to challenge your residential life staff, your RAs, to program in a way that encourages courageous conversations and tough conversations to explore identity, and then also supporting them in that, because oftentimes our RAs are still exploring themselves, right? Talk about current events. I think what happens often is we are okay about acknowledging the current events that happen in our society, but we don't revisit them. We don't go and follow up with, okay, and how has this event impacted you based on your identities, right? So continuing to work through those and not just acknowledge and move on. Remembering social media, I mentioned earlier. Class selection, oftentimes I forget that, like, oh yeah, I can definitely support my students. I might not be able to throw a program for them or bring a resource to campus because of whatever reason, but I can help them pick classes that would be challenging and encourage them to explore their identity. They're already taking classes, they have to meet basic requirements anyway, so how can we make them most appropriate and helpful for our students? And then encouraging involvement overall, encouraging them to interact in different spaces with different individuals and have those conversations to kind of dive deeper in different ways. Okay, so this is a case study. We won't do it today, but I think I do want to talk through the questions that go along with this. So I'm just going to read it to you. Taylor is a first-year student who identifies as mixed and lives in your building. She is the most recent in a long line of family members to attend the university and live in the same hall. She is involved in hall governing board, works as a CA at the desk, and is a strong scholar. It is not uncommon for you to see Taylor with friends in the dining center or in an intramural sport. One day, Taylor stops by your office and shares that she's just not feeling connected and wishes she knew herself and her heritage, culture, and identity better. So the questions that I've paired with this are, what are some questions you might ask Taylor? So as you're thinking about how, if the student was sitting in your office and how you might interact with them, oftentimes just prompting our students to think through their identity or think through what they've been feeling can be helpful. What are resources that exist on your campus to support Taylor? Sometimes we aren't aware of the most recent and the most relevant resources, or if we know of the resource, we've never visited it ourselves. So we might be referring students away, and then they get there and it's a dead end for them, and then they stop exploring altogether because they're so frustrated or whatever they're feeling. So it's important that you're aware of the supports and resources on your campus, and you also understand what they provide to the students. And then how are you feeling? Oftentimes the way that we feel impacts the way that we show up as supports to our students. If you're nervous when the student is sitting in your office telling you this information, why is that? And what can you do to help educate yourself so you're more prepared and more confident and comfortable having this conversation with the student? Or are you feeling really eager to engage? Well, maybe you share a salient identity, or you have had a similar experience in the past. How can you tap into that to because Taylor might not be the only student feeling that, right? So how can you tap into that to share that support and validation with other students? Okay, so we're at the point. I've been talking at you for almost an hour here. I want to open it up for questions, so I'm going to pop back over. There's a thank you slide. This is my daughter about a year ago now, so she's much larger, but still just as cute. So I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing my screen so I can see you, and then turn to questions.
All right. We are open to questions. You can go ahead in the chat bar on the YouTube link that you're on. Please post those. You just have to be logged in to any type of Google account. But we'll give it a few minutes here to add any questions you have there, and then I will ask those of Melinda. Did you have any other closing thoughts or anything else that you wanted to share while we're waiting for people to write questions?
Sure, yeah. So normally when I do this presentation in person, I have a few resources, and I have links for them that will be distributed. But the first one is this. You saw it on one of my slides, and you won't be able to read it here. But on the front side, what it is a breakdown of Wren's identity patterns, as well as on the back, support strategies for multiracial identity development and different things that you can do, as well as different resources you can tap into if you're looking for more. The book that I referenced in the presentation, I'll grab off my bookshelf now, but it is fairly old. It's called The Interracial Experience, and it's Growing Up Black and White, Racially Mixed in the United States. Very interesting. Another book that is relevant and perhaps helpful is called Mixed. I got this from Amazon recently, and it's just different narratives of different multiracial mixed individuals, and they're all college students that tell their life stories. So often we tap people to retell their experiences. Well, this is people telling their experiences without you having to, again, ask that one staff member to share. So I think that's beneficial as well. And then The Loving Case I mentioned, there's a movie, you can buy it from Amazon, that speaks to the story of the Loving Case. And last but not least, often when people attend this presentation, they're coming not only for their students, but for their children or their brother or so on and so forth. So I brought this time. It's called I Am Mixed, and this is the book that I brought with me to my first Mix Not Mix Up presentation as an RA. I now read it to my daughter, but it talks about twins that don't necessarily right off the bat look alike, but they're related and they're mixed, and it's important that we understand their story. So just some information and some additional resources.
Great. Thank you for sharing all those resources. Not seeing any questions pop up. The only question I had was the books, and I'm glad you brought those back up because I definitely wanted to make sure we got those out to people. And we will be sending out some links, and I'll be putting them in the comments so that you can be able to see all the presentation materials and all the links to the books if you choose to buy any of those. Looks like we have a question here from Joe Han. Hello, fellow mixed race professional. what research or experience have you seen about the intersectional identity with mixed race, and for example, a mixed race trans woman?
Yeah, so those narratives have, I have not encountered a way such as the book that I shared where those narratives are just there, right? I think we are still trying to reach out for that. That is the 2.0 version of this, and that's where I'll be going next. As of this summer, I'm going to be diving into identifying more research and literature on the intersection of identity. It's a question that has come up now multiple times in this presentation, and I think as I speak from only one lens is challenging. So as I move forward, I look forward to engaging with other multiracial individuals that share different aspects of identity and exploring what is out there.
Great. Not seeing any other questions. So I just want to thank Melinda for such a great presentation today and for hosting our December webinar. We're going to go ahead and I will put the link to the webinar in the comments here and then the group chat. But make sure to catch us again next month in January for our January 1st Friday webinar. Thank you and have a great day, everyone.
Bye. Thank you all.